My name is Lexi Lucas. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a sergeant in the United States Army. I've been trained to face the enemy in some of the harshest places on Earth. But no training could have prepared me for this moment, right here in my family's marble-tiled Dallas kitchen. My left arm made a dry, sickening crack under my father's weight. The pain was a white-hot flash, but what was killing me from the inside was his calm voice. "Don't be so dramatic, Lexi. I was just holding you back." My mother, instead of rushing to my side, hissed from across the room, her voice as sharp as a shard of broken glass. "Harrison, be careful. What will happen to your new golf course deal if she calls the police?" She wasn't worried about my bones. She was worried about the numbers in her husband's bank account. They made one fatal mistake. They thought they were breaking a daughter. They didn't know they had just armed a soldier. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been treated by your own family like you were collateral for their image. The first thing I registered wasn't the pain. It was the cold. The imported Italian marble of the kitchen floor was like a sheet of ice against my cheek, a stark contrast to the searing fire shooting up my arm. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Above me, my father, Harrison Lucas, stood not as a parent, but as a victor on a battlefield of his own making. He wasn't looking at me, crumpled on the floor. His attention was on his wrist, on the meticulous task of adjusting his gold Rolex watch. The soft click of the clasp echoed in the cavernous room. "See," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion except for a chillingly calm disappointment. "You always make me take it this far." There was no apology in his tone, no remorse. It was the voice of a CEO reviewing a failed project. In his world, violence wasn't a loss of control. It was a management tool. Then, movement. My mother, Eleanor, hurried across the room. For a split second, a foolish, childish part of me thought she was coming to help. But she didn't come to me. She went to the enormous stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerator, its hum a low, indifferent drone in the background. She pulled open the freezer door, the cold air misting out, and rummaged inside. She returned not with a phone to call for help, but with a bag of frozen organic green peas. She knelt, not beside me, but at a careful distance, as if I were something contagious. "We have the photo shoot for D Magazine tomorrow," she explained to the air, her voice a tight whisper. Her focus was absolute. She wasn't treating an injury. She was containing a public relations crisis before it could even begin. She pushed the icy bag into my good hand, her touch feather-light and impersonal. "Hold this," she commanded softly. "And be quiet. You know how stressed your father is." That was it, the final betrayal. Not the snap of the bone, but the quiet hiss of her words, prioritizing a magazine cover over her daughter's agony. My father's stress was the justification. My pain was an inconvenience. Harrison began to pace, his expensive leather shoes silent on the polished stone. He had shifted roles now, from executioner to prosecuting attorney. This was a familiar performance, a monologue he had perfected over years of breaking me down. He walked back and forth in front of the massive kitchen island, a magnificent slab of granite where just hours ago we had pretended to be a normal family eating breakfast. "It's about respect, Lexi," he began, his voice taking on the reasonable, lecturing tone he used in boardrooms. "It's about understanding your place." He wasn't yelling anymore. This was worse. This was the calm, methodical dismantling of my reality. He talked about the pressure he was under, a multi-million-dollar real estate deal, the endless demands of his empire. He spoke of the legacy he was building, a legacy I had apparently disrespected by daring to have an opinion. The catalyst for tonight's violence? I had suggested we shouldn't sell a small plot of land that my grandparents had loved. A sentimental thought. In the Lucas family, sentiment was a liability. He stopped pacing and pointed a finger at me. "In the army, they teach you to follow orders, don't they? They train you to understand the chain of command. Why is it that you can learn that from strangers, but you can't learn it in your own home?" He twisted my service, my source of pride, into another failing. My discipline wasn't a virtue. It was a tool he felt entitled to wield. My refusal to blindly obey him wasn't a sign of character. It was a flaw in my military training, an insult to him personally. My mother, ever the loyal second in command, nodded in perfect synchrony. "That's right, honey," she chimed in, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. "A family is a unit. Your father is the commanding officer." The words hung in the air, sucking out what little oxygen I had left. A unit, a commanding officer. They had turned the one place I was supposed to be safe into another war zone, but one with no rules of engagement, no Geneva Convention. Just absolute power. I pushed myself up, my whole body screaming in protest. My gaze swept across the room, past the designer furniture and the abstract art that cost more than a car. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and utterly fake. My eyes landed on the family portrait hanging in the dining area. A huge, professionally shot photograph of the four of us, my brother included, all wearing perfect, toothy smiles. We looked happy. We looked like the American dream. The crushing pain in my arm was the only truth in this house. I knew the script. If I stayed, the story would be rewritten by morning. Lexi slipped on the marble floor. So clumsy. And I would be expected to nod, to smile through the pain, and to play my part. The thought of that lie was more agonizing than the shattered bone in my arm. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. I ignored my father's sharp intake of breath, the unspoken order to stay down. I needed to get out. Not to get even, not yet. I just needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with deceit. My keys were on the counter. I lunged for them. "Where do you think you're going?" Harrison's voice was a low growl, the one he used right before the storm broke. Eleanor moved to block the door, her body a physical barrier between me and freedom. Her face was a mask of theatrical panic. "Lexi, don't be foolish. Think of the family." But her words had lost their power. Tonight, they had shown me exactly what the family was. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was the threat. The pain radiating from my arm gave me a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. I brushed past her, not even bothering to shove. It was as if she were a ghost. I fumbled with the keys, my good hand shaking. I finally got the door to my Jeep open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. As I gunned the engine and peeled out of the long, winding stone driveway of our Highland Park estate, I glanced in the rearview mirror. They weren't chasing me. They were just standing there on the porch, two perfect silhouettes against the glowing mansion. Not a panicked mother and father, but two business partners, already calculating, already planning their damage control. The drive to Dallas Presbyterian Hospital was a blur of streetlights. My right hand was clenched on the steering wheel, my left arm a useless, throbbing weight. Every pothole, every bump, sent a fresh wave of agony through my arm. But it was a strange kind of pain. With each pulse of fire in my bone, a ghost of another pain, an older and deeper ache, would surface. It was as if my broken arm was a key, unlocking a library of wounds I had kept locked away. The physical pain was calling out to its spiritual siblings, and they were all answering at once. The first ghost arrived from when I was 16, a memory I hadn't thought about in a decade. I was standing in the doorway of my father's mahogany-walled office, clutching a gold-plated trophy so tall it felt absurd. I'd just won the Texas State Debate Championship. I had argued for hours, my voice raw, my mind sharp, and I had won. I felt invincible, eager to see the look on his face. He was on the phone, of course. He glanced up, his eyes barely registering me or the award I held out like an offering. He gave an irritated frown, put a hand over the receiver, and said to his business associate, "No, it's nothing important." Then he made a shooing motion with his hand. "Go away." The trophy's weight suddenly felt immense, a block of lead. I walked away without a word and placed it on a side table in the living room. It stayed there for a week, gathering dust, an island of unrecognized achievement in a sea of neutral-tone decor. Then it was gone. My mother had quietly moved it to a storage closet in the basement. "It just didn't really match the aesthetic, honey," she had explained gently, as if discussing a misplaced cushion. They hadn't just dismissed my victory. They had erased the evidence. The Jeep hit a dip in the road, the memory shifting as the pain in my arm sharpened. The ghost of my West Point graduation arrived. That should have been the proudest day of my life. The crisp uniform, the weight of the diploma, the sense of honor filling the air. My parents threw a lavish party for me afterward at a high-end steakhouse downtown, filled with Harrison Lucas's most important investors. I was standing near the bar when I overheard my father's voice. He was laughing, a deep, charming sound. "She's a stubborn one," he told some developer, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "I figured a few years in the army would teach her where her place is." The man chuckled. My father continued, "At least she's learning to follow orders. That'll be useful for management later on." His words hit me harder than any physical blow. West Point, a place that forges leaders, was, in his eyes, nothing more than a glorified obedience school. An investment in making me more compliant, more useful to his empire. I looked over at my mother, standing right next to him. She saw me looking. She didn't flinch. She just gave the investor a dazzling, practiced smile and elegantly refilled his wine glass. A silent, graceful act of complicity. I began to see the pattern then, the map of scars drawn on me over a lifetime. It wasn't just the big moments, it was 1,000 tiny cuts. The canceled plans with friends because my father needed the perfect daughter at a business gala. The spring break I'd missed to play hostess for his executives. I was a prop, a well-dressed accessory to his success. And my mother was the stage director, always whispering just before an event, "Smile, Lexi. This contract is very important to your father." My sacrifices were never love or contribution. They were my duty, my obligation to a family business I never asked to be a part of. The most vivid memory, the one that still makes my throat tighten, was from a Christmas 2 years ago. The whole extended family was there, gathered in our living room, the giant tree twinkling with thousands of lights. I was home on leave, excitedly telling my cousins about a brutal survival training course I had just completed. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and I was proud. In the middle of my story, Harrison cut me off, not even looking up from his phone. "That's nice," he said dismissively. "But when are you going to do something of actual value? You know, like make some money?" The words, spoken so casually in front of everyone, sucked the air out of the room. My cousins looked down at their feet, embarrassed for me. My aunts and uncles suddenly found their drinks fascinating. My proud story of resilience was instantly redefined as a worthless hobby. My smile froze, and Eleanor, the master of social harmony, just gave a light laugh and smoothly changed the subject to the weather. A masterful act of social peacekeeping, executed by leaving her daughter to bleed out quietly in the middle of the room. Tonight, driving through the empty streets of Dallas with a broken arm, I realized none of these were accidents. It wasn't just a thoughtless comment here, a dismissive gesture there. It was a system. A deliberate, sustained campaign to keep me small, to ensure I never felt valuable on my own terms. My worth was only ever measured by my utility to my father's ambition and my mother's social standing. It's a lonely feeling, isn't it? To build yourself up, to achieve something you're proud of, only to have it treated like it's nothing by the very people who are supposed to be your biggest fans. If you know that feeling, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, please support this story by hitting the like button. And in the comments below, just write 3 simple words. You are seen. Because sometimes that's all we ever really needed to hear. Laying it all out piece by painful piece, I finally understood. The real injury wasn't the fracture in my ulna. It was the realization that my entire life had been lived under an unspoken, silent command. Be whatever we need you to be, and never, ever be yourself. Tonight, I had broken that command, and now I had to figure out what to do with the terrifying, painful freedom that came next. The automatic doors of the emergency room at Dallas Presbyterian slid open with a soft whoosh, and I stepped from the quiet, lonely night into a world of controlled chaos. The air inside was thick with the smell of antiseptic, a clean chemical scent that was jarringly different from the curated floral fragrances of my home. Fluorescent lights on the ceiling hummed with a relentless, buzzing energy, casting a cold, flat light on everything and everyone. Phones were ringing, machines were beeping in a steady, rhythmic chorus, and a low murmur of voices. Nurses, doctors, worried family members formed a constant, anonymous soundtrack. It was loud, overwhelming, and impersonal. And for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. At home, the silence was the enemy. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, thick with unspoken rules and expectations. Every object in every room was a reminder of my place, of the Lucas name and the weight that came with it. But here, in the stark, functional reality of the ER, none of that mattered. Here, I wasn't Harrison Lucas's daughter. I was just another patient in a crowded waiting room, a name on a list. The very impersonality of the place was a strange kind of sanctuary. It was a neutral zone. After checking in, a nurse with a tired but kind face led me to a small cubicle, separated from the next by a thin, pale blue curtain. She took my vitals with practiced efficiency, her questions brief and to the point. When she asked for my name, I just gave her my first name and last initial. She wrote Lexi L. on the chart without a second glance. Seeing it written there, that small, anonymous identifier, gave me a bizarre sense of safety. Lexi L. wasn't a disappointment or a problem to be managed. She was just a person with an injured arm. The nurse told me a doctor would be in shortly and then pulled the curtain closed, leaving me alone. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape began to drain away, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. And in the quiet of the small cubicle, with only the distant beeping for company, the voices I had been running from began to creep back in. They weren't real, but they might as well have been. My mother's voice, laced with that familiar, panicked disapproval. "You're ruining everything, Lexi. You're making such a scene." My father's voice, colder and more dangerous. "You are overreacting. It was a minor accident." I squeezed my eyes shut. Was I? Was I overreacting? The thought coiled in my stomach like a snake. For 27 years, their version of reality had been my own. Maybe this was just a small thing, a family argument that had gotten out of hand. Maybe I should have just held the frozen peas, stayed quiet, and let it all blow over. The impulse to go back, to apologize, to smooth things over and restore the toxic, fragile peace was so deeply ingrained in me, it felt like a reflex. It would be easier. It would be normal. Then a sharp, stabbing pain shot up my arm, a brutal physical reminder that snapped me back to the present. I looked down at my left arm. It was already beginning to swell, the skin tight and shiny under the fluorescent light, a dark, ugly bruise blooming across my forearm. This was not a small thing. This was not normal. This pain was my answer. It was real. I pulled out my phone, my fingers clumsy. My first instinct was to scroll through contacts, but who would I even call? There was no one in my family who would take my side. Calling a friend would mean trying to explain a lifetime of secrets in a single, panicked phone call. I didn't want to talk. I just needed an anchor, something true to hold on to in the middle of this internal war. I opened my audiobook app and found the book I'd been listening to on my last flight home. Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. I put in my earbuds, and the chaotic sounds of the ER faded away, replaced by her voice, warm, steady, and full of a grounded strength that felt a world away from my own. I skipped back to a passage I'd highlighted. Her words flowed directly into my ear, a quiet command that cut through the noise in my head. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. To show up and be seen. The phrase hit me with the force of a physical impact. My entire life, the primary directive had been the opposite. Blend in. Don't make waves. Don't be difficult. Keep up appearances. Be perfect, but be invisible. My achievements were only acceptable if they reflected well on my father. My pain was only acceptable if it could be hidden before the magazine photoshoot. Being seen, truly seen, was the one thing that was never allowed. Her next words cemented it. Courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. A new order, a new mission. And this one felt right. It felt true in a way that my father's commands never had. In that small, sterile cubicle, a decision crystallized in my mind. It was a quiet click, as definitive as a rifle bolt sliding into place. I would not hide this. I would not swallow this pain and pretend it didn't happen. I was going to let this wound, all of it, be seen. The curtain swished open, and a young doctor with tired eyes and a kind face stepped in. He had a clipboard in his hand. "Lexi L?" he asked, offering a small smile. "I'm Dr. Evans. What seems to be the problem tonight?" He pulled a rolling stool over and sat down, his pen poised over his chart. And for a moment, I froze. The pre-programmed lie, the official family story, rose to my lips automatically. I fell down the stairs. It was so easy, so clean. It would end the questions and let me retreat back into the familiar silence. But then I looked down at my arm, at the undeniable physical proof of the truth. Brené Brown's voice was still a faint echo in my ears. "Show up. Be seen." I took a breath. It felt like the first real breath I had taken all night. "I was assaulted," I said. My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the cubicle, it sounded like a gunshot. I cleared my throat and said it again, louder this time, clearer. "I was assaulted by my father." The words hung in the air between us. Saying them out loud felt like breaking a 27-year-old spell. Dr. Evans's pen stopped moving. He slowly looked up from his clipboard, his professional demeanor falling away. His tired eyes met mine, and for the first time that night, in the eyes of a complete stranger, I didn't see judgment. I didn't see disbelief or disappointment. I saw trust. The silence that followed my confession was heavier than any I had ever experienced at home. Dr. Evans simply stared at me, the pen frozen in his hand. The tired kindness in his eyes was replaced by a look of sharp, sudden focus. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate motion, and then stood up. "Excuse me for one moment, Sergeant Lucas," he said, his voice now carrying a different, more serious weight. He didn't question me. He didn't doubt me. He simply left the cubicle, pulling the curtain shut behind him, leaving me with the echo of my own terrifying truth. He returned less than a minute later, but he wasn't alone. With him was an older woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and she carried herself with an air of calm authority that was instantly familiar to me. It was the posture of a commanding officer. "Sergeant Lucas," she said, and her voice was not filled with pity, but with a crisp professional respect. "I'm Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of this emergency department." She didn't ask me to repeat my story. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She walked over to the backlit screen on the wall where my x-rays were displayed, her eyes scanning the ghostly white images of my bones. She pointed a decisive finger at the screen. "This is a classic spiral fracture of the ulna," she stated, her tone as clear and objective as a field report. "It does not happen from falling down the stairs. It happens when someone grabs the wrist and twists, hard. Your report is consistent with the medical evidence." Her words landed in the quiet room with the force of a judge's gavel. For the first time, my truth wasn't just a feeling or a memory. It was a fact, validated by science, undeniable. The story I had held alone for so long was now confirmed by an expert, a commander in this new, neutral territory. I felt a tremor go through me, a strange mix of terror and profound relief. A nurse came in then to start fitting me for a temporary cast. As she worked, gently wrapping my arm in layers of plaster, Dr. Thorne pulled the rolling stool over and sat down near me, her presence a quiet, steadying force. "I served 10 years in the Army," she said, her voice low, "meant only for me. Trauma surgeon, spent most of my time in Kandahar." She looked at me then, and her gaze was different from a doctor's. It was the look of a fellow soldier. "I know the look of a soldier who finds themselves in enemy territory. And Sergeant," she said, her eyes holding mine, "you're there right now." That was it. That was the thing that broke through the walls I had spent a lifetime building. All the training, all the discipline, all the carefully constructed composure I used to survive. It all just crumbled. Tears I didn't even know were there began to well up, hot and unstoppable, blurring the harsh fluorescent lights above me. I, who had been trained never to show weakness, was crying in front of a stranger. Dr. Thorne didn't offer me a tissue. She didn't say any placating words. She simply reached out and placed a firm hand on my good shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of solidarity. It was solid, respectful, and grounding. "You're safe here," she said, her voice a low, steady command. "Here, we have protocol. Protocol. Procedure. A chain of command based on rules and ethics, not on the whims of a tyrant." It was the most comforting thing I'd ever heard. Right then, as if summoned by the chaos, the curtain was ripped open. My mother, Eleanor Lucas, stood there, her face a mask of panic and fury. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes darted around the small cubicle as if looking for a threat to neutralize. "Lexi, what on earth are you doing? I've called you a dozen times." Her voice was a sharp, accusatory hiss. She saw my arm in the half-finished cast, and then her eyes landed on Dr. Thorne with undisguised contempt. "There must be some misunderstanding here," she said, her voice shifting into a smooth, dismissive tone she used for hired help. "My daughter can be a bit clumsy." Dr. Thorne rose from her stool. She didn't move aggressively, but she positioned herself so that she was standing squarely between me and my mother. She was a human shield. "Mrs. Lucas," she said, her voice perfectly calm and level, "your daughter is my patient. And as per hospital protocol and state law, when we have a patient presenting with clear signs of adult domestic abuse, we are mandated reporters. We are required to notify the authorities." Eleanor's face went pale. The mask of controlled frustration fell away, revealing pure, unadulterated fear. "You can't do that," she stammered, her voice losing its edge. "Do you have any idea who my husband is?" It was her trump card, the phrase that had opened every door and solved every problem in her life. Dr. Thorne didn't even blink. She reached for the phone mounted on the wall. "I have a very clear idea of who I am," she said, her voice dropping, each word laced with the steel of absolute conviction. "I am a doctor who honors the Hippocratic Oath." With my mother watching, stunned into silence, Dr. Thorne calmly dialed an extension. "This is Dr. Thorne in the ER," she said into the receiver. "I need to report a suspected case of adult domestic assault. The victim is an active-duty military service member." Every word she spoke was a brick being laid in a wall of protection around me. I could see the confidence draining from my mother's face, her world of influence and control dissolving before her eyes. She looked at me, and in her gaze there was no love, no concern. There was only a cold, venomous sense of betrayal. "You have ruined this family," she hissed, her voice a low, trembling whisper. But her words had no power here. The most important sound in the room was no longer her voice, but the calm, steady voice of a stranger on the phone, demanding justice on my behalf. Just as Dr. Thorne hung up, the curtain swished open once more. A uniformed Dallas police officer was standing there, his expression somber and professional. The neutral zone was no longer neutral. The authorities had arrived. The arrival of the police officer, a middle-aged man with a tired face who introduced himself as Officer Miller, had brought a tense, procedural calm to the room. But it was the calm before the storm. I knew it wouldn't last. The door to my cubicle flew open again, not pushed, but thrown, hitting the wall with a loud bang. And then the storm was there. Harrison Lucas didn't walk into the room. He strode in, a hurricane of tailored wool and righteous fury. He was flanked by his personal lawyer, a man whose face was a permanent, practiced sneer. My father's eyes, cold and blue, swept the room and completely ignored me on the bed. His entire focus, his entire being, was aimed like a weapon at Dr. Thorne. "Who in the hell are you to interfere in my family's private business?" he boomed, his voice accustomed to filling boardrooms and silencing any opposition. The air in the small space crackled with his rage. Officer Miller stepped forward, placing himself subtly between my father and Dr. Thorne. "Mr. Lucas, I'm going to need you to keep your voice down," he said, his tone weary but firm. Harrison let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Calm down? You want me to be calm?" He gestured dismissively toward me, as if I were a piece of faulty equipment. You people are taking the word of a mentally unstable girl. She just got back from a war zone. She's got PTSD. She probably doesn't even know what she's saying. The accusation was a deliberate, tactical strike. He was weaponizing my service, the one thing in my life I was truly proud of, and twisting it into a sign of weakness, of madness. He wasn't just denying what he did, he was trying to erase my credibility as a human being. The heat of shame and rage washed over me. Having deployed his first weapon, he changed tactics. He turned to Dr. Thorne, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, oozing a condescending sort of charm. It was the voice he used when he was about to close a deal. "Dr. Thorne," he said, glancing around the hospital cubicle with distaste, "I understand this hospital is fundraising for a new cardiology wing, isn't it? A generous check could certainly clear up this little misunderstanding." It was a blatant, disgusting move, part bribe, part threat. The air went still. Dr. Thorne looked at my father, and her expression was like ice. Not angry, but something colder, something harder. "Mr. Lucas," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of authority, "my integrity is not for sale." Unfazed, Harrison turned his attention to Officer Miller. The condescension remained, but now it was tinged with the casual arrogance of power. "I'm sure the Dallas Police Department has its own needs as well. The mayor is a very dear friend of mine." He said it so simply, so certain that the mere mention of his influence would be enough to make this all go away. Officer Miller didn't react. He didn't even look up from his notepad. He just tapped it once with his pen. "Good for you," he said in a monotone voice. "Now, would you like to make a statement, or are you finished?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in my father's eyes. Surprise. His power, the currency he had used to rule his entire world, wasn't working here. These people weren't his employees. They weren't his investors. They were operating on a different set of rules. And that's when he turned to me. All his other weapons had failed, so he came back to the one he had owned and operated for 27 years. Me. He took 2 steps toward my bed, his face a twisted mask of fury. The charm was gone. The condescension was gone. This was the man I knew. This was the rage from the kitchen. "Lexi," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Look at me." Against my will, my eyes lifted to meet his. "Tell them you fell. Tell them it was an accident. Say it." The last 2 words were not a request. They were a command, delivered with the full weight of a lifetime of dominance. And the soldier in me, the daughter in me, the part of me that had been conditioned for nearly 3 decades to obey that voice, flinched. I felt myself physically shrink back into the hospital pillows. The old, familiar fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile courage I had just found. It would be so easy to give in. So easy to say the words and make it all stop. As if to add to the pressure, my mother, who had been hovering silently in the background, took a half step forward. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea. "Save us, Lexi. Save this life. Save our world." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. It felt like the world had narrowed to this single moment, to the space between his command and my response. I looked at my father, and behind the rage, for the very first time, I saw it. Desperation. He was losing control, and it terrified him. I looked past him to my mother, and I didn't see a villain. I saw a prisoner, just as trapped in this golden cage as I was, begging me to lock the door behind me. Then my gaze shifted to Dr. Thorne, standing tall and unshakable. To Officer Miller, his pen patiently waiting. Strangers. They didn't know me, but they were standing here for the truth. They were standing here for me. I took a breath. It wasn't the stale, recycled air of my father's mansion. It was the clean, antiseptic air of the hospital, the air of the neutral zone. It was the air of freedom. My voice, when it came, was not loud. It wasn't a shout or a scream. It was quiet, but it was as steady and solid as the hand Dr. Thorne had placed on my shoulder. I didn't fall. I looked directly into my father's eyes. "You broke my arm." The words were a declaration of war. Harrison froze, his face a picture of stunned disbelief, as if he'd been shot with his own gun. For a moment, the entire room was wrapped in a profound silence. But this time, the silence was no longer his. I had taken it back. After my father's final, impotent threat echoed and faded, a security guard escorted him and my mother from the room. The sudden silence they left behind was a physical thing, a void that rushed in to fill the space their rage had occupied. The high-octane adrenaline that had flooded my system, the fuel that had powered my defiance, drained away all at once, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its place. I felt a deep, profound emptiness. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. I stared at the pale blue curtain, feeling utterly and completely alone. Officer Miller cleared his throat, pulling me back to the present. He walked over and handed me a cold bottle of water. "You did good, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact. That simple sentence, a professional acknowledgement from one person in uniform to another, meant more to me than any medal I'd ever earned. It was a validation of my courage, not just my actions. A moment later, an older nurse came in to change the sheets on my gurney. She was African American, with kind, knowing eyes and a gentle presence that immediately put me at ease. She introduced herself as Gloria. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer any empty platitudes. She just went about her work with a quiet efficiency, her movements calm and reassuring. As she smoothed the clean, crisp sheet over me, she leaned in close, as if sharing a secret. "Isaiah 41:10, she whispered, her voice a low, warm murmur. "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." She gave my shoulder a gentle pat and then was gone, leaving those ancient words to settle over me like an invisible suit of armor. I wasn't a particularly religious person, but in that moment, her quiet act of faith was a lifeline. It was a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I felt. Shortly after, another woman entered the cubicle. She had a calm, capable energy about her, and she smiled warmly. "Lexi," she said, using my first name in a way that felt instantly disarming. "My name is Ms. Chen. I'm a victim advocate from the family place here in Dallas." She explained that her job was to help me understand my options, to be a guide through whatever came next. She sat down, her posture open and non-threatening. "Now," she began, her voice gentle but clear, "if you're ready, I'd like you to tell me and Officer Miller everything. Not just about tonight. Anything you feel, you can share." Her invitation was the official order to do something my military training had conditioned me against: to declassify the past. For years, I had compartmentalized my pain, locking each traumatic memory away in its own secure file in my mind. It was a survival mechanism. Now, these two strangers were asking me to open the vault. It was a terrifying, yet necessary process. So I began to talk, and as I spoke, my voice shifted. The emotional, reactive daughter disappeared, and the trained intelligence analyst took over. I gave them my report. I didn't cry. I didn't embellish. I presented the facts. I described the systematic campaign of emotional and psychological warfare that had defined my life. I reported on the incident of the state debate trophy, dismissed as unimportant and hidden in the attic because it didn't match my mother's decor. I detailed the events of my West Point graduation, where my 4 years of relentless effort were summarized by my father as a convenient way to teach me obedience. I recounted cold Christmases where my accomplishments were measured against a single metric: their monetary value. I spoke of the endless social events, the canceled plans, the sacrificed pieces of my youth, all offered up on the altar of the perfect family image. My mother's whispered reminders to, "Smile, darling. This contract is important to your father." Each memory was a data point, part of a larger pattern of abuse. Throughout it all, Officer Miller wrote, his pen scratching methodically across his notepad, never interrupting. Ms. Chen just listened, her gaze steady and unwavering, occasionally nodding to show she understood. They weren't just hearing my story, they were collecting intelligence, they were validating my experiences, transforming my pain from a private shame into a public case. They were building a weapon out of my truth, The process took nearly 2 hours. When I finally fell silent, a heavy quiet settled over the cubicle again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of 27 years of truth, finally spoken aloud. Officer Miller reviewed his notes and then looked at me. "I'm going to type this up into a formal statement," he said. "I need you to read it carefully. If everything in it is true and accurate, I'll need you to sign it." He returned a short time later with 4 pages of clean black text. He handed the clipboard to me. "Take your time," he said. I read each word. It was my life, my map of scars, distilled onto paper. The humiliation, the anger, the quiet heartbreak. It was all there, laid out in the cold, objective language of a police report. Seeing it all written down, chronologically, factually, made it undeniably real. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was evidence. Before I made the final move, I thought about how many of us are taught to stay silent, to keep the peace, to protect an image that is slowly killing us. This report, this piece of paper, was my voice finally refusing to be silenced. If you believe that every survivor's story deserves to be heard and documented, hit the like button for this video. And in the comments, just type, "I hear you." It's a simple way to show the world that we stand with those who are brave enough to speak their truth. Officer Miller handed me a black pen. I took it in my right hand, my good hand. I looked at the final page, at the empty line at the bottom. This was it. The point of no return. This was the final, illegal order from my father, and I was about to officially, formally, refuse it. My hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. I put the pen to the paper. The signature was not the looping, elegant script my mother had insisted I learn. It was sharp, angular, and decisive. Sergeant Lexi Lucas. That signature wasn't just a confirmation of a report. It was a vow, a solemn oath made to myself that my silence was over. For good. Signing my name on that police report was like pulling the pin on a grenade. The vow of no silence was made, but the immediate consequence was that I had nowhere to go. Returning to my parents' house was not an option. I had just officially declared it enemy territory. Ms. Chen from the family place seemed to anticipate this. As soon as Officer Miller left, she put a comforting hand on my arm. "You're not going back there," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We have a place for you." That place was the Genesis Women's Shelter and Support, a secure facility tucked away in a quiet Dallas neighborhood. As Ms. Chen drove me there, I watched the familiar, opulent streets of Highland Park give way to a more normal, everyday world. The room she showed me to was small and simple, with a single bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto a quiet courtyard. There was no marble, no vaulted ceilings, no oppressive artwork. And it was the safest I had felt in my entire life. That night, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I slept without being on alert. There were no heavy, angry footsteps to listen for on the polished wood floors, no tense, suffocating silence to dread. The air in the small room felt lighter, cleaner. In military terms, this shelter wasn't just a hideout. It was my new forward operating base. It was the secure ground from which I could regroup, rearm, and plan the next phase of the mission. The following morning, I met with Miss Chen again. She was joined by a woman named Mrs. Davis, a sharp, focused lawyer with an air of quiet competence. We sat around a simple table in a small meeting room, and the atmosphere felt less like a victim counseling session and more like a pre-mission strategy briefing. Mrs. Davis spread a few documents out on the table between us, a map of the legal battlefield. "Lexi," she began, her tone direct and professional. "This is an information war. Your father is going to use his money, his influence, and his team of lawyers to paint a narrative. He will portray you as unstable, unreliable, and vindictive. Our mission," she continued, looking me straight in the eye, "is to counter his fiction with indisputable fact." For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a surge of something other than fear or anger. Purpose? This was a language I understood. Analyzing a threat, developing a strategy, executing a plan. Mrs. Davis laid out the operational steps. First, we would file for an emergency protective order to legally keep my father away from me. The core of our offensive would be the medical report from Dr. Thorne and the police report I had signed. That was our heavy artillery. Then, we would need to gather supporting intelligence. Any witnesses? Any past incidents that show a pattern of behavior? She asked. As she spoke, I felt my training as an intelligence analyst click into place. I was no longer just the daughter, the victim. I was a strategic asset in my own case. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table. A text message. It was from a number I hadn't seen in a while. My cousin, Mark. He was one of the few relatives who had always treated me like a person, not a chess piece in my father's game. My heart pounded as I opened it. The message was a punch to the gut. Lexi, I'm so sorry. I heard what happened. Just wanted to warn you, Uncle Harrison is on the warpath. He's calling everyone in the family, telling them you had a complete mental breakdown from PTSD and that you hurt yourself to get attention. He's threatening to cut off anyone who even talks to you. A wave of cold fury washed over me. He was executing his smear campaign perfectly, just as Mrs. Davis had predicted. But then I read the next part of Mark's text, and my analyst brain took over. P.S. He did something just like this years ago to an old business partner, a guy who tried to sue him. Ruined the man's reputation completely. Just thought you should know. I took a screenshot of the messages. This wasn't just a painful family drama anymore. This was actionable intelligence. It was proof of a pre-existing tactical playbook. It established a pattern. I immediately forwarded the screenshot to Mrs. Davis. She read it, her expression hardening. This is good, Lexi, she said, her voice sharp with focus. This is excellent. It helps us establish a pattern of systematic manipulation and retaliation. This is motive. The final phase of our preparation was the hardest. Mrs. Davis told me I needed to write everything down. Every incident, every threat, every belittling comment, every act of humiliation. I had spent my entire life trying to forget these things, to bury them. Now, I had to excavate them, but this time, it was for a purpose. I bought a simple black spiral notebook from the shelter's small store. That afternoon, I sat at the small desk in my room and began to write. I didn't write a diary. I wrote a dossier. Each memory was cataloged with dates, locations, and direct quotes where I could remember them. The trophy. The West Point dinner. The Christmas comment about making real money. The constant cutting remarks. The silent, complicit smiles from my mother. The process was agonizing. It felt like walking through a minefield of my own trauma. But with each entry I wrote, something shifted inside me. The memories were no longer just heavy, shapeless burdens I carried in the dark. By writing them down, by giving them dates and context, I was transforming them. They were no longer just my pain. They were evidence. They were exhibits. Each memory was no longer a ghost that haunted me. It was a bullet, carefully logged and ready to be loaded. That simple black notebook was becoming my armory. I was turning my tears into testimony, my trauma into tactical advantage. I was no longer the victim of my past. I was the architect of my justice. The Dallas County Family Court Building was a cold, imposing structure of concrete and glass. The courtroom itself was even more so. All dark wood, muted lighting, and a suffocating formal silence. It was designed to feel important, to feel heavy. It was the stage, and today, my life was the play. My parents sat at the opposing table. They looked exactly as they were meant to, powerful, respectable, wronged. My father wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my car, his expression a carefully crafted mask of paternal concern. My mother was beside him, a statue of quiet dignity in pearls and a Chanel dress. They looked like the victims. They were good at that. My father caught my eye and gave me a look of pure, condescending pity. A look that said, "This little tantrum of yours is about to be over." I smoothed down the front of my simple, dark blue dress. I sat with my back straight, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me. A soldier at attention. To my right was Mrs. Davis, my lawyer, her files organized in a neat stack. To my left was Ms. Chen, my support, my squadron. The first person we called to the stand was Dr. Eris Thorne. She walked to the witness box with the same no-nonsense confidence she had in the ER. She was our opening move, our unshakable first line of defense. Mrs. Davis led her through the initial testimony. Dr. Thorne presented the medical facts with the cool, detached precision of a surgeon. She explained the X-rays, pointing out the specific nature of the break. "This is a spiral fracture of the ulna," she stated, her voice clear and steady. "These are not caused by a simple fall. They are the result of a significant twisting force being applied to the wrist and forearm." She went on to describe the bruising on my shoulder and upper arm, concluding, "The patient's injuries are, in my professional opinion, wholly inconsistent with her parents' explanation of a fall down the stairs." When it was the other side's turn, my father's lawyer, a slick man with a venomous smile, approached the stand. He tried to chip away at her credibility, bringing up her tenure, questioning her emergency room's procedures. Dr. Thorne didn't even blink. She answered each question with cold, hard facts. She was a fortress, and his attacks bounced off her harmlessly. Then, it was my turn. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the witness stand and swore the oath. Mrs. Davis was gentle, her questions designed to let me tell the story in my own words. I kept my voice steady, just as we had practiced. I recounted the events of that night, sticking to the facts, just as I had in my written report. The real battle began when my father's lawyer stood up for the cross-examination. He approached me slowly, his movements theatrical. "Sergeant Lucas," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He held up a large photograph for the judge and the court to see. It was a picture of me in Afghanistan, dressed in full combat gear, my face smudged with dirt, holding my M4 rifle at a low ready. A picture of strength, a picture I had been proud of. "You're a highly trained soldier, are you not?" he asked. "Yes, I am," I replied. "Trained in combat. Trained to handle weapons. Trained," he paused for dramatic effect, "to use lethal force. To kill, correct?" "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." Mrs. Davis was on her feet instantly. The judge, a stern-faced woman, looked from the lawyer to me. "Overruled. I'll allow the question. Answer it, Sergeant." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. My training covers a wide range of scenarios, including the use of lethal force under the rules of engagement. The lawyer smiled. He had what he wanted. "Of course." He took a step closer. "So, Sergeant, given your extensive training in violence, isn't it possible, isn't it plausible, that in a moment of emotional distress, perhaps a flashback related to your PTSD, that you lost control? That you became so angry, so violent, that you injured yourself and are now trying to blame your loving, supportive father for the tragic results?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a stunning, brutal attack. He had taken my service, my honor, my strength, and twisted it into a weapon to be used against me. He was painting me as a monster, a broken soldier too damaged to be trusted. I could feel my father's eyes on me, victorious. I could feel the jury staring, their expressions now clouded with doubt. For a single, terrifying second, the floor fell out from beneath me. The rage and humiliation were so intense, I thought I was going to be sick. Then I remembered my training. Breathe, assess, respond. I took a single, slow, deep breath. I didn't look at the lawyer. I didn't look at my parents. I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "With all due respect to counsel, he fundamentally misunderstands what a soldier is trained to do." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I was trained to protect the innocent, not to attack them. I was trained to identify a threat, no matter its form, and to neutralize it. I was trained to remain calm under extreme pressure. And above all, I was trained to report the truth, accurately and without emotion." I let my gaze drift from the judge, over the jury, and finally, I let it land on my father. And that is exactly what I am doing today. I held his stare. He looked away first. "That threat assessment training," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "is what helped me finally recognize that the greatest danger to my personal safety wasn't on a battlefield in a foreign country. It was the man sitting at that table. That training in remaining calm under pressure is what allowed me to drive myself to the hospital with a broken arm instead of collapsing on his marble floor. And that training in accuracy and reporting the facts is why every single word of my testimony and every word in the report I gave to the police is the absolute, unshakable truth. I finished speaking. The lawyer stood there, his mouth slightly open, the smug smile completely gone. He had no follow-up question. He had fired his best shot, and I had turned it right back on him. He mumbled a quiet, "No further questions, Your Honor," and retreated to his table. The battle was won. The sharp, definitive sound of the judge's gavel striking the wood echoed the finality of my testimony. "A permanent protective order is granted," she announced, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "This matter will be referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Across the room, I saw my father's face contort into a mask of pure disbelief, then rage. For the first time in his life, Harrison Lucas had been told no by a power greater than his own. As a court officer stepped toward him, instructing him to maintain his distance, the dam of his composure broke. He began shouting, not at the judge, but at me. Empty threats, nonsensical accusations. It was the impotent roar of a king whose castle walls had just been breached. I didn't feel the triumphant satisfaction I had expected. As I watched the bailiff escort my parents from the courtroom, I didn't feel like a winner. I just felt empty. A vast hollow space had opened up inside of me. The air was thick with the aftershock of the explosion, and in the ringing silence, a devastating truth settled in my bones. I had won the war. But in doing so, I had officially lost my family. A few hours later, I was back in the quiet solitude of my temporary apartment, a small furnished place Miss Chen had helped me secure. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar sofa, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the chaos of the courthouse. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a name I hadn't seen in days. Mother. My breath caught in my throat. 100 different scenarios flashed through my mind. Was she calling to scream at me? To apologize? A foolish, hopeful part of me flickered to life. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I answered. It wasn't anger on the other end of the line. It was the sound of weeping. Not the raw, heartbroken sobs of grief, but the careful, calculated sobs of manipulation. "Lexi, darling," Eleanor began, her voice thick with practiced despair. "Please, I'm begging you. You have to undo this. You have to drop everything. Your father, he won't survive this. Our reputation, everything we've built, it's all turning to dust." I listened, my hand clenching the phone. She never once asked if I was okay. She never asked about my arm, about my safety. Her concern wasn't for her daughter, it was for the empire. Her tears were for the cracks that had appeared in the facade. She was polishing the marble while the foundation crumbled. A profound, weary sadness washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of hope. For 27 years, I had been waiting for her to choose me. In that moment, I finally understood that she never would. She had made her choice long ago. She was a willing citizen of my father's kingdom, and I was the traitor at the gates. "Mom," I said, and I was shocked at how calm my own voice sounded. It was a calm born not of anger, but of a terrible final clarity. "I gave you 27 years to choose me. You didn't." The sobbing on the other end stopped, replaced by a stunned silence. "I wish you well," I said, the words feeling both impossibly heavy and liberatingly light. "Please, don't call me again." I ended the call before she could respond, before she could deploy another wave of guilt. I set the phone down, the definitive click echoing in the quiet room. The final thread, the one I had clung to for so long, had finally been cut. Later that evening, I unpacked the small bag I'd brought with me from the shelter. At the bottom was the folded-up copy of the protective order. I sat on the bed and smoothed it out. The black ink on the official letterhead was stark and impersonal. This wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a victory cup to be displayed on a mantle. It was my honorable discharge papers, It was the official, legally binding document that released me from a war I never enlisted in. It was a formal acknowledgement that the battlefield I'd grown up on was too dangerous for me to return to. I stared at my name, Sergeant Lexi Lucas, and for the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to cry. These were not the hot, angry tears of the courtroom, nor the terrified tears of the kitchen floor. These were tears of pure, unadulterated grief. I cried for the little girl who had spent her life desperately trying to earn a love that was never unconditional. I cried for the teenager whose achievements were only ever seen as assets or liabilities. I cried for the innocence that had been chipped away, piece by piece, until nothing was left. I grieved the family I was supposed to have, the family I now knew I had truly and irrevocably lost. A few days passed in a quiet blur. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock at my door. A delivery man stood there with an enormous, extravagant basket of white lilies and roses, wrapped in cellophane and tied with a ridiculously large gold bow. It was the kind of arrangement sent to funerals. The card was tucked into the flowers. It was from my father's office. It read simply, "We can forget this ever happened." No apology, no acknowledgement, just a command, dressed up as a peace offering. An attempt to erase reality, to bury the truth under a pile of expensive flowers. The old me would have been torn. The old me would have seen it as an olive branch, a chance to restore the toxic peace I had mistaken for normalcy. But I wasn't the old me anymore. I didn't throw the basket in the trash. That would have been a reaction, an emotional outburst. Instead, I picked up my phone and called the number on the florist's label. "Hello," I said calmly. "I received a delivery that was sent to the wrong address. I need you to come and pick it up and return it to the sender." It was my first official act as a free woman, a small, simple act of setting a boundary. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, firm, non-negotiable statement. I am no longer participating in your games. My reality is not for sale. I watched from my window as the delivery van came back and the driver loaded the opulent basket back inside. As it drove away, I felt the final lock click into place. That door was now closed. 6 months after the judge's gavel fell, I stood in the pre-dawn chill of Fort Hood, Texas. The air was cool and carried the scent of dust and damp earth. Around me, the familiar sounds of a military base coming to life were a kind of symphony. The distant rumble of trucks, the rhythmic thud of boots on pavement, the clipped, professional voices of soldiers preparing for the day. This place, the Army, which I had once joined as a means of escape, now felt less like a refuge and more like a home. A real one. Here, the rules were clear, logical, and written down for all to see. The chain of command was based on rank and merit, not on mood swings and manipulations. Respect wasn't demanded through fear. It was earned through action and competence. As I pulled on my uniform, the familiar weight of the fabric felt different. It was no longer a suit of armor I wore to hide the bruised and broken daughter underneath. It wasn't a mask. It was simply me. The tough, resilient fabric felt like a second skin, a symbol not of what I was running from, but of the strength I had forged in the fire. For the first time, wearing it felt like freedom. My weekends changed too. The quiet hours that once felt long and lonely were now filled with a new kind of purpose. Instead of losing myself in the anonymous crowds of downtown Austin or Dallas bars, I started spending my Saturdays at a small, unassuming, nonprofit organization just off base. It was a center dedicated to helping female veterans transition back to civilian life. The building was a converted bungalow with comfortable, slightly worn sofas and the constant smell of brewing coffee. It was the furthest thing from the cold, intimidating institutions I'd come to associate with getting help. I wasn't there as an expert or a counselor. I was there as a peer, a fellow soldier. I sat with women who had faced down enemies in combat zones only to come home to battles they were never trained for, navigating the bureaucratic maze of the VA, fighting for custody of their children, or escaping domestic situations that were hauntingly familiar to my own. I listened to their stories, and in return, I shared pieces of mine. I discovered that the skills my father had once twisted and used against me could be repurposed for good. My analytical training helped me sit with younger veterans and break down complex benefits paperwork into manageable steps, turning a mountain of confusion into a clear objective. My ability to remain calm under pressure, a skill honed in the worst of circumstances, allowed me to be a steady presence for a woman in the midst of a panic attack, talking her through it until the storm passed. I wasn't saving them. We were supporting each other. In their stories of survival and resilience, I found my own. We were a different kind of unit, bound by the shared understanding of wars fought both abroad and behind closed doors. We were turning our scars into service. My definition of family was also being rebuilt from the ground up on a new, solid foundation. I kept in touch with the women who had stood with me in the sterile ER room, my first, unexpected allies. When I had leave, I'd drive into Dallas and meet Dr. Thorne and Miss Chen for coffee at a small, independent coffee shop. We wouldn't talk about the court case or the trauma. We'd talk about our jobs, about a funny article we'd read, about the ridiculous Texas weather. We talked about normal things. They became my chosen family, the steady, supportive women who had seen me at my absolute worst and had chosen to stand by me without question. I also reconnected with my cousin, Mark. He and his wife invited me over for backyard barbecues, simple gatherings with cheap beer, smoky brisket, and easy laughter. There were no hidden agendas, no conversations that felt like walking through a minefield. We were just family, creating new, small, authentic traditions to replace the hollow, gilded ones I had left behind. It was a slow, quiet process, learning to let my guard down, learning to accept kindness without searching for the price tag. It was a different kind of vulnerability, the courage to believe in peace after being conditioned for war. Which brings me to this morning. The sky's just beginning to soften from black to a deep indigo. I stand at the head of my platoon, my breath pluming in the cool air. I give the command and we fall into formation, a single living entity of shared purpose. Left, 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 right, left, I call out, my voice cutting through the morning quiet. A chorus of voices responds, a powerful, unified sound behind me. The rhythmic pounding of our boots on the asphalt is a steady, reassuring heartbeat. As we run, the first sliver of the sun ignites the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. A new day. A real one. I'm no longer running away from a dark past. I'm leading my soldiers toward the dawn. Back in my barracks room, tucked away in a small locked wooden box in my desk drawer, is the permanent protective order. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. It's not a reminder of the pain. It's not a symbol of a broken family. It's a medal. It's the citation for winning the most important battle of my entire life. My father was wrong. My story doesn't end with him, silenced on his marble floor. It doesn't end with his verdict in a cold courtroom. It ends here, on this open road, with the sun on my face and the sound of my soldiers at my back. It ends with my next mission. To live. My mission to live has just begun. And it's a mission I no longer walk alone. Thank you for walking it with me, for listening to my story. If any part of this journey resonated with you, please know that you are not alone either. Your own mission to heal and reclaim your story is the most important one you'll ever undertake. Please hit that like button to show your support for survivors everywhere and share your strength by commenting with a single word that describes what gets you through tough times. Let's fill this space with hope. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and finding the dawn.